and welcome to Witness History on the BBC World Service with me, Claire Bowes. In the year 2000, the European Union finally banned all its member states from selling leaded petrol. It came years after it had been banned in Japan, the US and Canada because of concerns over children's health. I've been speaking to the leader of the campaign against lead in petrol in the UK about why it took so long. Lead is poisonous. Large amounts can lead to brain damage, and it's particularly harmful to babies and children. In the 20th century, it was often found in water pipes, paint and canned food.
Excuse me, can I give you one of these to read, please? It's about lead in petrol and the way that it damages children's brains.
But it wasn't until the late 1970s when parents like this one began raising awareness of the effects of lead in petrol. Meanwhile, in central London, Robin Russell-Jones, a medical doctor, was educating himself on the issue. He began by getting his baby daughter's lead level checked.
It was within what was deemed safe at the time, but it was higher than average. It was about 23 micrograms per decilitre. On the other hand, clinical lead poisoning happened at about 75 or 80, so it wasn't that safe. And the levels now that are regarded as safe is below 5.
Lead does occur naturally in air, soil and water. But in the 1920s, a special form of it, called tetraethyl lead, was produced. When added to petrol, it prevented engines from making a knocking sound and made the fuel run more efficiently.
It reached a maximum in 1971. I think about 400,000 tonnes of lead were added worldwide to petrol.
From the petrol, the lead made its way into the air through car exhausts.
In fact, it was showed later that lead levels in Greenland and Antarctic started to increase as a result of the dispersion and dissemination of these very small particles throughout the entire globe, really.
But no one knew how all this lead in the air might affect people. Scientists had recorded rising levels of lead in people's bodies. Here in Britain, Professor of Environmental Medicine Patrick Lawther believed that leaded petrol couldn't be responsible for the increase. Here he is in 1971.
And the tempting assumption is that if we halved or if we reduced by a factor of 5 the lead in busy streets, then our body lead burden would decrease by a factor of 5, and this is nonsense.
The government asked Professor Lawther to chair a report on the issue. It was released in 1980. He remained unconvinced about the role of petrol in lead poisoning. But Dr. Robin Russell-Jones says the problem was that cars were dispersing lead in a way that had never happened before. It was landing on crops and soil and finding its way into the food chain, not just into people's lungs.
When Professor Lawther and his committee looked at lead, the only route that they were prepared to acknowledge as being a source of lead from petrol was what was breathed in. And everyone knew that only 10% of lead in humans was a result of breathing it in. The rest came from eating or drinking food and drink that was contaminated by lead. And they sort of assumed in the report that that was all natural lead. But of course it wasn't.
Increasingly frustrated, Robin wrote an article to The Times. It was seen by a multi-millionaire who offered to fund a campaign.
Hello again. A major campaign to ban lead in petrol was launched today. It's called CLEAR, which stands for the Campaign for Lead-Free Air.
Lead-free petrol now! Lead-free!
And as the campaign gained momentum, the petroleum industry protested. Associated Octel, which produced the lead for petrol, maintained their product was not causing brain damage in children.
But I do refute the argument which suggests that our product, in fact, is causing damage to the minds of future generations, because I just don't accept that argument at all.
All the industries involved had calculated how much removing lead would cost them. At the time, the oil companies said it would be nearly $600 million a year. This was mounting. Studies showed modern lead levels were 10,000 times greater than the natural levels found in pre-industrial skeletons. In America, experiments assessed children's behaviour, comparing it to their exposure to lead.
I will leave these in this order, and I'm going to tell you to do some things with these.
They found the children with high lead exposure had difficulty concentrating and had a lower IQ.
I know what to do whatever may happen.
He did what was asked of him to do.
He did what he was asked of him to do.
And the children in urban areas had lead levels 5 times higher than those in the suburbs. Here in the UK, Dr. Robin Russell-Jones shared the findings with the British media.
These children tend to be very impulsive, they're easily distracted, they're easily frustrated. They often can follow fairly simple instructions, but they have difficulty following complicated instructions. And these, of course, are precisely the characteristics that one finds in inner city areas today.
And his critics pounced on that.
And the argument was that lower class children were more likely to be living in houses with peeling paint or old pipes or near to highways. So then the argument was, well, the relationship between high lead and low IQ is because there's a social class difference. But I mean, that's where the animal studies were very important, because it demonstrated that didn't explain it, that there was a genuine causal relationship.
Lead-treated animals of the same sex and same age, I think you can see a great deal more active. There's a great deal of fighting among these animals, and they're very hard to catch.
The CLEAR campaign sent newsletters full of the latest research direct to members of Parliament. They also held a conference and invited leading medics. Gradually, the official position of several influential experts began to shift.
The government is now under increasing pressure to ban the use of lead in petrol. A letter written by the government's chief medical advisor has been leaked to the press in the last few days. In it, he says there is a strong likelihood that lead in petrol is permanently reducing the IQ of many of our children.
And that was complete dynamite. So we took that to the editor of the Times, Harold Evans, and he put it on the front page. And then after that, the whole thing took off.
Good evening. Nationwide tonight, better safe than sorry. As the government announces that it's going to ban lead in petrol, we'll be asking Environment Minister Tom King how soon we'll all be driving lead-free cars and at what cost.
The answer was not very soon. The decision to phase out lead in petrol in the UK came in 1983. But making unleaded available at the pumps wasn't enough. People needed to trust that it wouldn't damage their cars. 5 years after the announcement, Dr. Robin Russell-Jones began campaigning again.
They finally, in 1989, introduced a tax on leaded fuel, and unleaded became cheaper. And then, of course, within 6 years, lead levels in British school children had fallen by 80%.
And in the years since, more and more research has pointed to the devastating impact of lead on health.
If you look at the rate of murder and violent crime in the US, it almost follows exactly the increase and decrease in the amount of lead added to petrol, but with a lag period of 20 years. And the implication is that exposure to lead in utero determines your later neurocognitive function and behaviour.
In 2011, the United Nations reported that the removal of lead from petrol had saved $2.4 trillion a year in terms of costs to health and society. Dr. Robin Russell-Jones continues to campaign for clean air. He was speaking to me, Claire Bowes, for Witness History.